Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding it right now. The room around you, whatever city, whatever floor, whatever quiet or noise is drifting in from outside, let it all soften a little at the edges. You do not need to be anywhere else tonight. You do not need to solve anything. You only need to listen. Picture a small room in Christian County, Kentucky. The year is 1900. A young man in his early 20s is lying flat on his back on a narrow bed, his hands folded on his chest, his breathing slow and even. He has not been able to speak above a whisper for nearly a year. Doctors have examined him. They have found nothing they can treat. His voice is simply gone, and no one has been able to say why. His name is Edgar Cayce, and in a few moments, in the particular stillness of a mind that has found a way to go somewhere most minds cannot follow, he is going to speak. Those present in the room would later report that what came out was not a whisper. According to accounts preserved from that period, it was a voice, clear and full, describing conditions inside his own body with a specificity that the people around him could not easily explain. He would wake up remembering none of it. This is not a story about whether you believe in what Edgar Cayce could do. It is a story about a man who lived with an experience he could not fully explain, who tried to use it honestly, who failed in some of the ways that people with unusual gifts often fail, and who left behind a documented record large enough and strange enough that researchers are still examining it more than 80 years after his death. Settle in. Let the night be quiet around you, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Farm Boy and What He Saw. There is a particular quality to the light in western Kentucky in the late afternoon of a summer day. It comes in low across the farmland, catching the dust that floats above the fields, turning the whole world a shade of gold that people who grew up there tend to carry with them for the rest of their lives as the specific colour of home. It is the kind of light that makes an ordinary place feel like it is on the edge of something larger. That makes a child standing in a field feel, without quite being able to say why, that the world goes further than the eye can see. Edgar Cayce was born on the 18th of March, 1877, in Christian County, Kentucky, on a farm in a small community called Beverly, about 8 miles south of the town of Hopkinsville. He was the son of Leslie B. Cayce, a farmer and local magistrate known in the community as Squire, and Carrie Cayce, a quiet and deeply religious woman whose faith shaped the household in ways that her son would carry his entire life. They were not wealthy. They were not poor. They were a farm family in the American South in the last quarter of the 19th century, which meant they lived close to the land, close to their church, and close to the rhythms of a world that moved at the pace of seasons rather than the pace of news. It was not, on the surface, a place or a family from which you would expect anything remarkable to emerge. The remarkable thing emerged anyway. Edgar was a quiet child. People who knew him in those years consistently described him as someone who listened more than he talked, who preferred the company of fields and trees to the company of crowds, and who had a quality of stillness about him that adults noticed without quite knowing how to account for it. His grandfather on his father's side, Thomas Jefferson Cayce, was a figure he adored. Thomas Jefferson Cayce died when Edgar was around 4 years old, in a drowning accident that the boy witnessed, and by the accounts Cayce himself gave in later years. The loss left a mark that did not fade quickly. He told his parents, when he was around 6 or 7 years old, that he could see and speak with figures that no one else in the room could see. He described them with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who has not yet learned that certain things are not said in polite company. He was not performing. According to accounts preserved by Thomas Sugrue, the journalist and biographer who worked closely with Cayce in the 1930s and 40s and produced the authorized biography called There is a River, published in 1942. He was simply reporting what he experienced. His parents responded with a combination of concern and prayer, which was the response that families of that era and that faith tended to reach for when confronted with something they could not categorize. It is important to say clearly here that the childhood accounts of Edgar Cayce come primarily from that single authorized source. Sugrue had access to Cayce's own memories and the memories of people who had known him as a child. But the events being described were recalled decades after they occurred, filtered through the memory of a man who had by then become fully aware of his own significance. This does not make the accounts untrue. It means we hold them with the care that any retrospective account deserves, neither dismissing them entirely, nor treating them as independently verified fact. With that said, there is one story from his early years that appears consistently across multiple sources, and that Cayce himself returned to often enough that it clearly held genuine meaning for him. He was around 9 or 10 years old. He had been struggling in school, specifically with spelling. His father, who believed in education with the particular intensity of a man who had not had much of it himself, was drilling him one evening on vocabulary he could not seem to retain. The session was not going well. Edgar was tired. His father was frustrated. At some point, in a pause between attempts, Edgar told his father that he needed to sleep for a few minutes. His father was not pleased, but the boy lay down with his spelling book placed beneath his head, slept briefly, and woke up able to recite every word in the lesson. He said the information had come to him while he slept, not as a dream, as a knowing. The A.R.E, the organization Cayce would eventually found, records this account as one of the earliest expressions of what would become the central pattern of his adult life. There is no independent documentation of the event beyond Cayce's own later account as recorded by Sugrue. What we have is a story a man told about himself, about an experience in childhood that he understood, looking back, as the beginning of everything that followed. We cannot verify it. We can note that it is consistent with what was documented about him by multiple independent observers across the next 4.5 decades. The school years in Hopkinsville were otherwise unremarkable in their outlines. Edgar attended local schools, developed a lasting appetite for reading, and built the 2 commitments that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The first was the Bible, which he reportedly read through completely once for each year of his age by the time he was a teenager. The second was faith. The Christian church congregation in Hopkinsville was the center of his social and spiritual world, and the values it taught: service, honesty, the responsibility of a person with any kind of gift to use it in the service of others, became the framework through which he would eventually try to understand what he was. When his family moved to Hopkinsville itself, he worked first at a dry goods store and later at a bookstore. He was By every account of the period, a pleasant young man, polite and hard-working and deeply religious in a quiet way, not the kind of person who announced himself, but, in the quiet of his own inner life, the experiences he had described as a child continued in forms he did not discuss widely. He understood himself, from early in his life, as someone different from the people around him in a way he had not chosen and could not turn off. He had not yet found the form that difference would take in the world. He was still simply a young man from a Kentucky farm, working ordinary jobs in an ordinary town, waiting without knowing he was waiting for the circumstances that would finally show him what he was for. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was working in Hopkinsville, engaged to a young woman named Gertrude Evans, attending his church, teaching Sunday school, and living the ordinary surface of a life that gave no particular indication of what was about to happen to it. Then, in March of 1900, without warning and without any explanation that the doctors he consulted could provide, his voice began to fail. It started as a gradual weakness, a rasp where there had been a clear tone. Then the rasp became a whisper. Then the whisper became unreliable. By the time several months had passed, Edgar Cayce could barely speak above a breath. He consulted local doctors. He tried the treatments they suggested. Nothing helped. His voice, which a young man needs to make his way in the world, to work, to court, to pray aloud in the church he loved, was gone. He was 23 years old. He was losing the ability to speak, and somewhere in the strange education his childhood had given him, in the memories of a spelling book beneath his head, and a quality of knowing that came to him in sleep, there was a direction he had not yet tried. He had not yet tried closing his eyes and asking whatever it was inside him that seemed to know things to tell him what was wrong. When he finally did, what reportedly came back was an answer, and nothing about his life was ever ordinary again. Chapter 2. The Sleeping Healer. There is a particular kind of desperation that comes not from catastrophe but from slow erosion. Not the sharp grief of a sudden loss, but the wearing quality of a problem that does not resolve, that outlasts every reasonable attempt at a solution, that begins to redefine a person not by what they can do, but by what has been taken from them. Edgar Cayce had been living with that kind of desperation for the better part of a year, when he finally tried something that no doctor had suggested, and that nothing in his formal education had prepared him to attempt. But before he arrived at the approach that would eventually work, he tried something else first. In 1901, a travelling stage hypnotist who called himself Hart and billed himself as the Laugh Man came to perform at the Hopkinsville Opera House. Hart heard about the young man in town who had lost his voice and offered to attempt a cure. Cayce agreed. The experiment was conducted in front of an audience. According to accounts from that period, Cayce's voice returned while he was in the hypnotic trance. When he woke, it was gone again. Hart had appointments in other cities and could not continue the treatment. He left Hopkinsville, and Cayce's voice went with him. What Hart's attempt did was establish something important. The trance state was not the obstacle. The voice was there, available. In that altered condition, the question was how to bring it back permanently. The answer came through a local man named Al Lane. Lane was an amateur hypnotist with a serious interest in suggestion therapy and osteopathic principles. He had heard about Cayce's situation and about the partial success with Hart, and he offered to continue the work. he was not a physician. He was someone who believed, on the basis of his own reading and experimentation, that what Cayce could access in the trance state was worth taking seriously and exploring more carefully than a stage performance allowed. Lane did something different from Hart. Instead of simply hypnotizing Cayce and suggesting that his voice return, he asked Cayce, once in the trance state, to describe what was wrong with his own body and say what needed to be done to fix it. According to accounts recorded by Sugru and preserved in the A.R.E. archive, what came through was a voice that was reportedly clear and strong in a way it had not been for months. Cayce spoke about his own body in the first person plural, using the word we rather than I, in a way that observers found notable. He described what he reported to be a circulatory issue related to his larynx. He said that increasing blood flow to the affected area would address it. He instructed Lane to suggest, while Cayce remained in the state, that the circulation increase. Lane followed the instructions. According to his later account and the accounts of others present, the skin of Cayce's chest and throat began to visibly flush with colour. Whether this represented genuine increased circulation, or a response to suggestion, or something else entirely, neither Lane nor anyone else present had the medical training to assess with certainty. What Lane reported was what he observed. The interpretation was beyond what the evidence available to him could support. Cayce was then brought out of the state. He woke up with no memory of what had been said. As accounts from this and subsequent sessions consistently describe, he asked Lane what had happened. Lane told him, and when Cayce tried his voice, what came out, according to Lane's account and those of others present, was not a whisper. It was his full voice, returned. After nearly a year of silence, the improvement was not permanent at first. Relapses occurred, and Lane conducted additional sessions to address them. Over the weeks and months that followed, the recovery is described in accounts from that period as progressing in stages until the restoration was described as permanent. Whether the sessions caused the recovery coincided with a natural recovery already underway, or involved some combination of both, is a question the available documentation does not allow us to answer definitively. What changed was not the medical certainty. What changed was Cayce's understanding of himself. He did not rush to make it into something larger than it was. The faith that anchored his life raised immediate and serious questions about what had just happened. A man who reads his Bible as carefully as Edgar Cayce did is a man aware that the tradition has complicated things to say about unusual capacities, about the sources of knowledge that do not come through ordinary means, about the difference between gifts oriented toward genuine service and other things that can look similar from the outside. He prayed about it. He talked to his minister. He took months before he agreed to try the same process for someone else. The second person he used the readings for was Lane himself, who had his own health problems that conventional medicine had not adequately addressed. Lane reported that following the recommendations from Cayce's reading produced improvement in his condition. After that, word began to spread in the way that word moves through a small Kentucky city, through personal connection, one household to the next. The case that drew the most early attention, and that the historical record documents more specifically than most others from this period, involved a child named Aim Dietrich. She was approximately 5 or 6 years old at the time of the reading. Though accounts differ slightly on her precise age, she had been suffering from severe convulsions since the age of 2, sometimes as many as 20 episodes per day, and had shown significant cognitive regression. Physicians who had examined her had not been able to identify a cause or an effective treatment. According to accounts documented in the A.R.E. archive, Cayce gave a reading for AIM in which he described what he reported to be a spinal injury sustained when she had slipped from a carriage before contracting influenza, and he recommended specific osteopathic adjustments to address it. Lane conducted the adjustments over a period of 3 weeks. According to accounts from that period, the convulsions stopped. The cognitive regression reversed over time. A signed affidavit from AIM's father, C.H. Dietrich, notarized on the 8th of October, 1910, and preserved in the A.R.E. archive, states that within 3 months she was in full health and that the case could be verified by many of the prominent citizens of Hopkinsville. AIM later attended school, graduated, and by the account of her father's signed statement, lived a normal, healthy life. Her father's affidavit represents one of the earliest formally documented cases in the Cayce record. AIM's father was the local superintendent of schools. His standing in the community gave the account a public weight that earlier cases had not had. People began coming to Cayce from further away. The circle of people who knew about the readings began to expand beyond the immediate network of Hopkinsville. Each case brought its own weight. Each brought the same fundamental tension that the first case had produced. The impulse to help people who were suffering, the uncertainty about what the state was and where the information in it came from, the anxiety about being wrong when people were making decisions about their health based on what he said. He was a man with a genuine conscience, operating in a situation that his conscience had no established guidance for. He was also, by the middle of the 1900s, beginning to understand that the situation was not going to resolve itself. The requests were not going to stop. The reported capacity, whatever its nature, was not going to disappear. He was going to have to find a way to live with it honestly. That search for how to live with something he could not fully explain would be the central work of his life for the next 4 decades. He was in his late 20s. He had no idea yet of the scale that was coming, but the shape of what was coming was already visible in the small room where he lay down and went still, and something reportedly spoke through him that those present could not account for. Chapter 3. The Man Who Wrote It Down. Every phenomenon that enters the historical record does so through someone who decided it was worth recording. This is true of battles and elections and scientific discoveries. It is also true of the quieter events, the ones that happen in private rooms with small audiences, the ones that might have dissolved entirely into local legend if the right person had not been present with the right instinct to preserve what was said. For Edgar Cayce, the preservation happened in stages. The earlier stage was Al Lane, who kept handwritten notes from the sessions he conducted. Those notes were imperfect. He was writing by hand, trying to keep up with speech, and the vocabulary that came through in the readings was sometimes technical enough that he had to reconstruct words phonetically and identify them later. But the notes existed, and they established a practice of documentation that would eventually become one of the most complete archives of its kind in the 20th century. The next significant figure in that chain of preservation was Wesley Ketchum. Ketchum was a homeopathic physician practicing in Hopkinsville who encountered Cayce through the network of people in the community who had heard about the readings. According to accounts from the period, Cayce's own father introduced them. Ketchum's initial response was appropriately skeptical. He had professional training and a professional reputation to protect. He tested the process. He sat in on sessions. He documented what he observed with the systematic attention of a clinician who was taking the question seriously while maintaining his professional skepticism. What he reported finding, over a period of careful observation, was a pattern of apparent specificity in the descriptions of physical conditions that he found, in his own assessment, difficult to account for through ordinary means. He was careful about how he described this. He did not claim supernatural explanation. He observed a pattern and reported it. In October of 1910, Ketchum presented his observations to a medical gathering in Boston. The New York Times picked up the story. On the 9th of October, it published an article with the headline, "Illiterate Man Becomes a Doctor When Hypnotized." The framing was sensational, in a way that Ketchum's careful clinical observations had deliberately avoided, and the effect was something Cayce had not prepared for. The letters began arriving from everywhere. People who had read the article, or heard about it from someone who had, wrote from across the country. They described conditions their doctors had not been able to treat. They asked for readings. They sent money. They were desperate in the specific way that people with chronic and unresolved illness become desperate. And the desperation in those letters was something Cayce, with his particular constitution, found almost impossible to ignore. His response to the sudden attention was complicated and, in retrospect, revealing of the tensions that would shape his life for the next 3 decades. He was not comfortable with the fame. He was not comfortable with money changing hands for the readings, because accepting payment had always felt to him like a compromise of something that should not be commercial. He was not comfortable with the scale, because scale made it impossible to maintain the careful, unhurried approach he believed the readings required to be genuinely useful rather than merely spectacular. But he was also unable to simply turn the letters away. The people writing them were suffering. They were asking for help, and the faith that had shaped his understanding of himself told him that a person with the reported ability to help carried some obligation to use it. This tension between the impulse to help everyone who asked and the practical impossibility of doing so without compromising the quality of what he could offer would recur at every stage of his life. It would contribute, in the end, to the physical collapse that preceded his death. He was a man who could not say no to need, even when saying no might have been the wiser and ultimately more sustainable choice. There is a dimension of this period that popular accounts often flatten. Cayce was not simply a healer operating in peaceful isolation. He was a man embedded in a set of relationships. With Lane, with Ketchum, with various partners and supporters across Kentucky and Alabama and Ohio, each of whom had their own interests in what the readings could produce. Some of those people had his interests genuinely at heart. Some were interested primarily in what his reported capacity could do for them. The record from these years, while less systematic than what came later, shows a man being pulled in multiple directions, trying to maintain the integrity of the work while surrounded by people who had their own ideas about what the work was for. He was living in Alabama by this point, having moved to Selma to work as a photographer, the trade he would practice alongside the readings for most of his adult life. He and Gertrude Evans had married on the 17th of June, 1903. Their son, Hugh Lynn, was born in 1907. A second son, Milton Porter, was born in 1911 and died in infancy within weeks of his birth. The loss was real, and the household absorbed it with the quiet endurance that families of that era and that faith brought to losses they could not prevent. Then, not long after Milton's death, Gertrude became seriously ill. The illness was tuberculosis. The physicians who examined her were not encouraging. By the accounts preserved from that period, including those in Sugrú's biography, the prognosis was poor enough that her recovery was genuinely uncertain. The medicine of that era had limited tools for tuberculosis, and the tools it had were not reliably effective for cases that had progressed significantly. Cayce gave readings for her. The readings described her condition and offered specific recommendations for treatment. According to multiple sources, including the A.R.E's historical record and Sugrú's documented research, Gertrude followed the recommended treatments and recovered. Her tuberculosis resolved. She went on to live a full life, working alongside her husband for more than 3 additional decades, until her own death on the 1st of April, 1945, 3 months after his. Whether the readings caused her recovery, contributed to it alongside other treatments she was receiving, or coincided with a recovery that would have occurred regardless, cannot be established with certainty from the documentary record. What the record does establish is that she survived an illness that the medicine of her era had regarded as potentially fatal, and that the people closest to her understood her survival as confirmation that the readings could address conditions of genuine severity. It also deepened something between them that was already more than an ordinary marriage. Gertrude had come to the readings not as a distant observer, but through the most personal possible door, as a patient, from inside the experience of nearly dying and reportedly recovering through recommendations that came from her husband's trance state. From that point forward, her relationship to the work was not simply that of a wife supporting her husband's unusual vocation. She became, in the Virginia Beach years, the primary conductor of the readings, the voice Cayce heard asking the questions, the presence in the room that the readings themselves would eventually describe as the person most suited to draw out the clearest and most specific information from the state. That role did not develop from circumstance alone. It developed from what illness and recovery and the particular intimacy of having been read for by your husband had made her into. She was not a supporting character in this story. She was one of the people without whom the story does not exist in the form it has. The documentation of the readings became significantly more systematic in September of 1923, when Cayce hired a young stenographer named Gladys Davis. She was 19 years old, from Selma, Alabama, and she had no prior background in any of the fields. The readings touched. What she had was precision, patience, and a commitment to the work that would keep her at Cayce's side until his death 22 years later and long beyond. Gladys Davis transcribed every reading Cayce gave from September of 1923 onward. Every one. She sat beside the couch where he lay, her stenographic pad on her knee, and recorded in shorthand what came through in the sessions. Then typed the transcripts afterward and filed them systematically. She also tracked outcomes where she could. When a person who had received a reading reported back on whether the recommendations had helped or not, she recorded that response and attached it to the original transcript. The result, built up over 22 years of daily work, is the archive that researchers examine today. It contains, according to the A.R.E, approximately 14,306 individual readings. They are cross-referenced by subject, by the person they were given for, by date, and by type. They are, as archives of this kind go, unusually complete and unusually organized for material produced under these circumstances. What they are not is simple to interpret. The readings span medical topics, philosophical discussions, accounts of what the readings described as past lives, commentary on world events, and guidance on spiritual practice. The voice that came through in the readings was not consistently the same register. In what came to be called physical readings, it used specific physiological vocabulary and spoke with a clinical precision that observers found notable. In what came to be called life readings, which addressed questions about a person's deeper history and purpose, it shifted into a more elevated and sometimes archaic register. In readings that addressed broader questions about history and the future, it spoke with a confidence about things that could not be empirically verified. Harmon Bro, a scholar with a background in psychology and religion who spent time living with the Cayce family during the 1940s and later wrote about his observations with genuine academic care, noted that the variation in register across the different types of readings was itself something that deserved careful attention. He observed that the physical readings had a quality of specificity and testability that the other categories did not share in the same way. What that difference meant, and whether all categories of readings came from the same source, was a question that even people who had observed the work closely for years found they could not answer with confidence. This is the honest place to stand on the question of the archive as a whole. It is large. It is more carefully documented than skeptics typically acknowledge. It is less definitively proven than believers typically claim. The portions of it that are testable have produced observations that serious researchers found worth examining. The portions of it that are not testable remain exactly that. And the whole of it is the record of a man who spent more than 40 years producing something unusual with a consistency and a seriousness that, whatever one concludes about its ultimate nature, is not easily set aside. Gladys Davis gave her life to preserving that record. She outlived Cayce by decades, continuing to work at the A.R.E, answering letters from researchers and seekers and skeptics with the same steady care she had brought to the pad beside his couch. The archive she built is the strongest reason to take Edgar Cayce seriously as a subject of honest inquiry, not because it proves what he was, because it makes it impossible to pretend he was not there. Chapter 4. The Man and His Faith. There is a kind of conflict that does not announce itself with argument or anger. It lives quietly inside a person, in the gap between what they experience and what they have been taught to believe about the nature of experience. It does not resolve quickly. It does not resolve through logic alone. It resolves, if it resolves at all, through years of living with the contradiction and finding, gradually and imperfectly, a way to hold two things that seem incompatible without letting either one destroy the other. Edgar Cayce lived with that kind of conflict for most of his adult life. He was, by every account of people who knew him, a genuinely devout Christian, not devout in the performative sense, not a man who displayed his faith as social currency. but devout in the way that means a person has organized their inner life around a set of beliefs and commitments that are more fundamental to them than anything else they know. He read his Bible every day. He taught Sunday school consistently in the various cities and towns where he lived. For most of his adult life, he prayed before every reading he gave. He prayed after. He prayed in the hours between, about whether what he was doing was right, about whether the source of the information that came through him was a source he could trust, about whether a man of faith was permitted to operate in the territory he was operating in. These were not casual questions for him. They were the questions his tradition had strong and sometimes uncomfortable things to say about. The Bible that Cayce knew as intimately as most people know their own names contains explicit warnings against certain kinds of practices: the consulting of spirits, the seeking of hidden knowledge through means outside the sanctioned channels of prayer and scripture, the engagement with forces that the tradition had categorized across centuries of theological development as belonging to a domain that faithful people were instructed to avoid. Cayce was aware of every one of those warnings. He had read the relevant passages not once but many times. He knew the arguments a critic from within his own tradition could make against what he was doing, and he took those arguments seriously, in a way that people who did not share his faith sometimes found difficult to understand. What he reported experiencing, however, did not feel to him like what those warnings described. The state he entered felt, from the inside as he described it, like a deepening of the same fundamental orientation towards something larger than himself that he practiced every morning when he opened his Bible. The information that reportedly came through in that state, particularly the information that appeared to help sick people, felt consistent with the values his faith had given him. Healing the sick was not a marginal activity in the tradition he belonged to. It was central. The question was not whether healing was a good thing to do. The question was whether the method he was using was a legitimate one. He put that question to ministers. He put it to the readings themselves, asking in the trance state whether what he was doing was spiritually acceptable, and receiving answers he found reassuring, even as he understood that the reassurance came from a source whose nature he could not independently verify. The circularity of this was not lost on him. He noted it in his own letters. With the honesty of a man who found the situation genuinely difficult rather than conveniently resolved, the answers that reportedly came through in those sessions consistently placed his work within a broadly spiritual framework. They spoke of service as the highest calling. They spoke of gifts described in the letters of Paul in the New Testament, gifts of healing and knowledge and discernment that the tradition had always acknowledged as real, even while debating their contemporary availability. They described the information in the readings as coming from a level of consciousness the readings called the universal mind, and sometimes the Akashic records, a term drawn from Sanskrit referring to a kind of cosmic record in which all experience was preserved. That last concept was where the tension became most visible. Akashic records was not a term from the Bible. It was not a term from any tradition Cayce had grown up with. When it first appeared in his readings, he did not know what it meant. He looked it up afterward, as he did with many specialized terms that appeared in sessions, and found it in the literature of theosophy. A spiritual movement popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that drew on Eastern philosophical traditions. He had not studied theosophy. He had not sought out its concepts. They had appeared in the readings, and he was now holding them in his hands. trying to figure out what to do with material he had not invited. He said in letters from this period that he was troubled by this. The readings were producing content that connected to traditions he had not studied and did not fully endorse. The question of where that content was coming from, and whether its source was trustworthy, was not one he could simply set aside. He returned to it often, across years, without arriving at a resolution that fully satisfied him, but the reported outcomes kept pushing him forward. When a reading reportedly described a condition in a way that proved useful, and the recommended treatment appeared to help the person, that outcome was real to those involved, regardless of where the information had come from. A mother whose child had been helped did not need a theological framework. She had a child who was better. And Cayce, who had grown up with the pragmatic faith of a farming community that measured the quality of a tree by the quality of its fruit, could not easily dismiss outcomes that looked, by any reasonable measure, like good fruit. The deeper challenge came when the readings began to address not just the physical body, but what they described as the soul's history across multiple lifetimes. Life readings, as they came to be called, were given in response to questions not about a person's health, but about their deeper nature, their purpose, the patterns shaping their inner life. And what came through in those sessions was not a description of a single human biography beginning at birth. It was a description of a soul's journey across multiple incarnations, in different bodies, in different historical periods. Reincarnation is not a Christian doctrine. The mainstream of the tradition to which Cayce belonged had consistently held that a human being lives one life. The concept of souls cycling through multiple bodies across centuries was associated with Eastern religions and with forms of alternative spirituality that Orthodox Christianity had positioned itself against. Cayce knew this, and the first time reincarnation appeared clearly in one of his readings, his response was not acceptance. It was crisis. He described this crisis in interviews with Sugru and in his own letters. He said he seriously considered stopping the readings altogether when he understood what they were claiming. He went back to his Bible, looking for a way to reconcile what the sessions were saying with the faith he had held his entire life. He spent weeks in what he described as genuine spiritual distress, unable to dismiss either the readings or the tradition, unable to hold both comfortably. The resolution he eventually reached was personal and provisional rather than systematic. He came to understand, or to decide, that the God he believed in was larger than any single tradition's description of that God, that the soul was more complex than the framework he had been given in childhood fully accounted for, that the information in the readings, including the information about past lives, was oriented toward helping people understand themselves and live better, which was consistent with the deepest values of his faith, even if the specific doctrinal content did not fit neatly within its official boundaries. He held this resolution with humility rather than certainty. He never stopped reading his Bible. He never stopped attending church. He never positioned himself as someone who had transcended Orthodox Christianity or discovered a superior truth. He described himself, consistently and until the end of his life, as a Christian who did not fully understand what was happening to him and who was trying, imperfectly and with genuine uncertainty, to use whatever reported gift he had been given in a way that was worthy of the God he believed had given it. The people who knew him best, Gertrude, Gladys Davis, Hugh Lynn, consistently described a man whose private character matched his public one. He was not performing humility. He was not managing a brand. He was simply who he appeared to be, which, in a figure of his kind of prominence, is unusual enough to be worth noting. His faith was not a resolution to the questions his life raised. It was the container in which he carried those questions across 45 years without being destroyed by them. For a man in his position, carrying what he carried, that may have been the most important thing of all. Chapter 5. Oil, Money, and the Cost of the Wrong Dream. There is a version of Edgar Cayce's story in which everything proceeds from the reported gift outward in a clean line, in which each application of the capacity finds its right expression, and the man moves through his life with purposeful clarity, helping where he can, building gradually toward the legacy he would eventually leave. That version is not the true one. The true version contains a period of years in which the readings were used in ways that were wrong for them, years in which the pressure of other people's ambitions and Cayce's own inability to refuse a request combined to produce a series of failures that cost him money he did not have, stability his family needed, and a clarity about the proper limits of his work that he had to learn at real cost. These years matter, not because they diminish what came before or after, but because they are the part of his story that popular accounts tend to skip over, and skipping over them produces a portrait that is cleaner than the actual man deserved, and less honest than the record supports. The central episode of this period involves oil. In September of 1920, Cayce became a partner in the Cayce Petroleum Company, formed with several business associates, including David Kahn and others who believed that the reported capacity he demonstrated in the trance state could be directed toward locating petroleum deposits underground. The logic was not entirely unreasonable on its surface. If Cayce could reportedly perceive, in that state, what was happening inside a human body he had never examined, perhaps he could perceive what was happening inside the earth at a location he had never visited. The men who proposed this were not all obvious frauds. Some were experienced in oil. Some were genuinely enthusiastic about what they believed Cayce could do, and the goal Cayce himself held. Raising enough money to fund a hospital where the readings could be applied in a proper medical setting was a legitimate one that gave the venture a purpose he could point to. Cayce's own attitude was conflicted from the beginning. He said in letters from the period that he was uncertain whether the readings would be reliable for geological purposes. He had always understood his medical work as being oriented toward people and their conditions, and pointing the same process at the ground and asking it to find oil was a different kind of request. He did not know whether it would work. He also needed money. His family needed stability. The possibility of a meaningful financial return was genuinely attractive to a man who had spent most of his adult life financially precarious. So he went to Texas. The company drilled wells in the San Saba area of central Texas, guided by readings that reportedly described geological formations in considerable detail and identified locations where oil should be found. The readings were specific enough that they were acted upon. The wells were drilled. One by one, the reports came back. This well, dry. That location, nothing. The consistency and specificity that reportedly characterized the medical readings was not present in the same way. The outcomes were ambiguous in the way that outcomes in probabilistic fields, like oil prospecting, can always be made to look like something or like nothing, depending on how generously you interpret the data. No commercially significant oil discovery was made on the basis of Cayce's readings during that period. By 1922, the venture had effectively failed. Cayce later wrote, in a letter preserved in the A.R.E. archive, words that cut through all the explanations and excuses available to him. The oil was there. He said, I just wasn't equal to handling the men who were associated with it. That sentence is worth sitting with, not because it resolves the question of whether the readings were accurate about the geology, but because it reveals something about the man. Even in accounting for his own failure, he was honest in a way that other people in his situation might not have been. He did not blame the readings. He did not blame the investors entirely. He looked at what had happened, and he said what he saw. He was in his mid-40s. He had moved his family from Alabama with expectations that did not materialize. Gertrude had come with him, as she always came, with the quiet practicality she brought to every difficult circumstance the life had handed them. Now he had to sit across from her and say what he had to say, that it had not worked, that they were going back, that the stability the venture had promised was not coming. There was no dramatic scene. There were no recorded speeches. There was only a man and his wife in a rented space in Texas, figuring out, as people do, what to do next when the thing they had counted on has not materialized. He came back without savings and without a clear path forward. The lesson arrived, as the important lessons tend to arrive, not as a single revelation, but as a slow accumulation of evidence that could no longer be reasonably ignored. He came to believe, in the period following the Texas years, that the readings did not function reliably when they were directed toward material acquisition. The sessions that appeared most useful, in the assessment of those who observed them across years, were the ones given in the spirit of genuine service, oriented toward alleviating suffering in specific people. The ones given under commercial pressure tended to produce results that were less clear and less verifiably helpful. Whether this reflected something about the nature of whatever was operating in the trance state, or something about his own psychology and how his internal condition affected what came through, or simply the inherent unreliability of applying any intuitive process to domains where chance plays a large role, was a question he could not definitively answer. The practical conclusion was the same regardless. The readings had a proper domain. He had tried to extend them beyond it. There is also a dimension of this period that has to do with the specific quality in Cayce that made him vulnerable to exactly this kind of situation, and that would make him vulnerable again. His faith told him that service was the highest calling. His temperament made confrontation and refusal genuinely difficult, and his financial circumstances made the promise of stability hard to turn down. The combination produced a pattern that repeated itself across his life. In the oil fields of Texas, and in later arrangements that came at him from different directions with the same essential structure, someone would arrive with a proposal. He would be uncertain. He would agree. The arrangement would not go as intended. What the readings were for was not what everyone around him kept telling him they were for. What they were for was more specific and more demanding than commercial prospecting. And the gap between what the readings could reportedly do and what people wanted them to do was a gap he was going to have to spend the rest of his life managing. He was going to have to find a place where the work could be done on its own terms. That place was waiting. He just did not know it yet. Chapter 6. Virginia Beach and the House That Readings Built. There are places that seem, in retrospect, to have been waiting for a particular person to arrive, not in any sense that requires special belief to appreciate. simply in the practical sense that a place and a person can be a better fit than other combinations that came before, that the specific qualities of a location can allow a specific kind of work to happen that previous locations did not permit. Virginia Beach in 1925 was that kind of place for Edgar Cayce. He came because the readings told him to. This is worth pausing on, because it is one of the more unusual aspects of how Cayce navigated major decisions, and one that requires honest acknowledgement rather than either credulous acceptance or reflexive dismissal. Throughout his adult life, when Cayce faced significant questions about direction, he would sometimes put those questions to the readings themselves. He would ask, in the trance state, about where he should live or what he should do, and what came back would be treated as guidance. The reading that directed him to Virginia Beach described the location as the right place for the work he was meant to do. It pointed to specific qualities of the environment, the proximity to water, the relative distance from the commercial pressures of larger cities, as factors that would support a stable and productive period. Whether that guidance reflected something genuinely perceptive about what the environment would make possible, or whether it reflected the preferences of a man who needed a fresh start in a place unmarked by previous failures, or some combination of both, is a question the record cannot answer definitively. What the record does show is that Virginia Beach was where Cayce did the most sustained and best documented work of his life. Whatever the source of the guidance, the direction turned out to be practically sound. He arrived with his family in September of 1925. Gertrude came. Their sons, Hugh Lynn and Edgar Evans, came. Gladys Davis came. Because, by that point, she was as essential to the operation of the work as any member of the family. They settled into a rented house on Arctic Crescent, which was consistent with the financial circumstances that had followed Cayce across most of his adult life. The early Virginia Beach years were not immediately easier than what had come before. Money remained a persistent concern. The network of supporters and donors that kept the household functioning was not yet stable enough to fully remove the financial anxiety that had been a constant companion since the Texas years and long before. There were periods when the family was genuinely uncertain about basic expenses. But something was different. The structure of the work was changing in a way that mattered. The readings Cayce gave in Virginia Beach were increasingly given in conditions that allowed for proper documentation and careful follow-up. Gladys Davis was recording everything. The people who came for readings were being asked, more systematically than before, to report back on outcomes. The accumulation of documented cases was beginning to produce something that looked like a real body of evidence rather than a collection of individual anecdotes. And that distinction mattered enormously to anyone who wanted to examine the work seriously. In the evenings, particularly in those early years, before the operation grew large enough to consume everything, Cayce would sometimes sit on the porch of the small house on Arctic Crescent. The ocean was a few blocks away, audible on quiet nights. Hugh Lynn, now a young man finding his own relationship to the work he had grown up watching, would sometimes sit with him. Gertrude would be inside, doing what Gertrude always did, making the household function with a minimum of drama and a maximum of quiet competence. Edgar Evans, still a boy, was doing what boys do, unaware that the house he was growing up in was anything other than ordinary. These were ordinary evenings, ordinary in the way that the surface of a life is always ordinary, even when what is happening beneath the surface is not. A man on a porch, the sound of the ocean, the work waiting for tomorrow afternoon. Gertrude was the quiet centre of all of it. The readings had identified her as the person most suited to conduct the sessions, and the sessions of the Virginia Beach years bore that out. She had a quality of steady, undramatic presence that the trance state appeared, in the assessment of those who observed the sessions, to respond to with the clearest and most specific information in the record. She never sought attention for this role. She performed it with the same practicality she brought to everything else, as if it were simply the next thing that needed doing, and she was the person there to do it. Construction of what would be called the Cayce Hospital for Research and Enlightenment began in the summer of 1928. On a 5-acre property overlooking the sea. It was a real hospital, not a metaphorical one. It opened in 1929 with 30 beds. It had staff. It had physicians who worked alongside Cayce, applying the treatments recommended in the readings to patients who came seeking help for conditions that conventional medicine had not adequately addressed. For the roughly 2 years it operated, it represented the most serious institutional attempt yet made to apply Cayce's readings in a structured medical environment. The hospital closed in 1931, a casualty of the Great Depression. The financial support that had made it possible evaporated when the economy collapsed, as the support for many institutions of that era evaporated under the same pressure. The closing was painful, because the hospital had represented the most concrete attempt yet to bridge what Cayce reportedly did with what medicine knew, and the closing meant that experiment was cut short before its results could be fully assessed. But out of the hospital's dissolution came something that proved more durable. In February of 1931, Cayce called a meeting of his supporters in Virginia Beach. He asked them directly whether they felt his work should continue. The gathering that resulted produced the Association for Research and Enlightenment, incorporated that same year, with Hugh Lynn Cayce assuming management of the new organization. The A.R.E. was structured differently from the hospital. It was not a treatment facility. It was a research and educational organization, dedicated to the study and preservation of the readings and to the exploration of the questions those readings raised about the nature of consciousness, health, and the range of human perception. The A.R.E. gave Cayce's work a legal and organizational home. It meant the archive Gladys Davis was building had an institution behind it. It meant that when Cayce died, the archive would not scatter or disappear, as the records of so many similar figures had scattered and disappeared when no institution was in place to receive them. Hugh Lynn was becoming increasingly central to the organization's operation and to the question of how the work would be presented to the world. He had grown up watching his father work and had developed, through that proximity, a sophisticated understanding of both the genuine dimensions of what the readings represented and the complicated human context in which they were produced. He would become, after his father's death, the primary steward of the legacy, and the intelligence and care he brought to that role would shape how the work was preserved and presented for decades. Virginia Beach was the right place. The work found its form here, and the form, once found, want, would hold until there was no longer a man to fill it. Chapter 7. 14,000 Voices. Let us stop the narrative for a moment, not to step away from the story, but to step inside the archive itself, because the archive is where the serious questions live, and treating those questions seriously is what distinguishes an honest account of Edgar Cayce from the two kinds of dishonest accounts that have dominated the conversation about him for decades. The first dishonest account accepts everything uncritically. It treats every reading as revealed truth, counts only the confirmations and ignores the failures, and presents Cayce as a figure of essentially supernatural authority whose record is beyond examination. This account fills much of the popular literature on Cayce and much of the content about him online. It is not useful for anyone who wants to understand what actually happened. The second dishonest account dismisses everything because some of it is unverifiable. It treats the absence of scientific proof as proof of absence, focuses only on the failures and the oddities, and ignores the portions of the record that qualified observers found genuinely difficult to explain away. This account is equally useless for honest inquiry. The honest account requires sitting with the archive as it actually is, large and uneven, containing things that observers found remarkable, and things that were ordinary, and things that were wrong, and things that cannot be evaluated in either direction, containing a human being who was sometimes reportedly right in ways that defied easy explanation, sometimes wrong in ways that are entirely explicable, and sometimes operating in domains where the question of right and wrong does not straightforwardly apply. The archive contains approximately 14,306 individual readings, given between 1901 and 1944, and held at the A.R.E. headquarters in Virginia Beach. They are indexed and cross-referenced in ways that make systematic examination possible. The organization has not attempted to hide or minimize the portions of the record that are ambiguous or unfavorable. Researchers who have examined the archive have described it as more complete and more organized than most comparable bodies of material from that era. The readings are organized into several major categories, and understanding those categories is essential to understanding what can reasonably be claimed about the archive as a whole. The physical readings, also called health or medical readings, constitute the largest single category. Approximately 9,000 of them. These are the sessions in which Cayce reportedly described physical conditions in people he had not examined, often people who were not present in the room, and offered specific recommendations for treatment. These are the readings that attracted the most attention from physicians during Cayce's lifetime and that have been most systematically examined by researchers since his death. What the examination of the physical readings shows, in the assessment of those researchers who have examined them most carefully, is not a simple story. Gina Seminara, a researcher who examined a substantial portion of the medical readings in work conducted in the 1940s and 50s, documented patterns in the descriptions of physical conditions that she found striking in their apparent specificity. She noted cases in which readings had described physiological details that attending physicians subsequently confirmed, and she approached the subject as a serious scholarly treatment rather than a promotional document. Her conclusions were carefully stated. She did not claim the readings were infallible or that their source was supernatural. She described a pattern of reported specificity that she, in her assessment, found difficult to account for through ordinary means. Harold Riley was a physiotherapist who operated a health practice in New York from the 1930s onward. He had no prior connection to Cayce and no particular inclination toward claimed psychic phenomena. His first encounter with the readings came when patients arrived at his facility carrying specific treatment recommendations from Cayce sessions. What Riley reported, across decades of clinical experience applying those recommendations, was that they were consistently coherent with his professional understanding of physiology, and that following them produced results in his patients that he, in his clinical assessment, found notable. He became involved with the A.R.E. on the basis of what he observed, and he maintained the professional skepticism of a clinician throughout, documenting both the results he found impressive and the uncertainties he could not resolve. Harmon Brough, whose background in psychology and religion gave him a framework for critical evaluation, spent time living with the Cayce family and observing the work firsthand. He noted that the medical readings displayed a quality of specificity that distinguished them from the vague generalities associated with most claimed psychic performance. He was not arguing for supernatural explanation. He was noting that, in his observation, the pattern of documented cases was not adequately described. From his perspective, as fraud or coincidence, the honest statement about the physical readings, based on the assessments of these and other observers who examined them directly, is this: multiple qualified observers, approaching the material with professional skepticism and professional training, reported finding patterns of apparent accuracy that they, in their respective assessments, found difficult to explain through ordinary means. Those reports do not establish a mechanism. They do not tell us where the information came from. They do not make every reading in the category accurate, but the consistency of independent observations across multiple decades represents a body of reported experience that serious inquiry cannot simply dismiss without engaging with. The life readings present a different situation entirely. There are approximately 2,500 life readings in the archive. These are the sessions in which Cayce reportedly described past lives of the person he was reading for, tracing historical incarnations and identifying patterns that he said were relevant to the person's current circumstances. They contain the references to Atlantis, to Ancient Egypt, to a range of historical periods that the readings treat as having been inhabited by the souls now living in 20th century bodies. These readings cannot be verified in the way a medical reading can be verified. There is no empirical test that can confirm or disconfirm the claim that a person's soul previously inhabited a body in ancient Egypt. The framework within which the life readings are even meaningful requires accepting premises about the nature of the soul and the structure of consciousness that lie entirely outside the domain of what current scientific methods can address. What can be said about the life readings is more limited and more honest. The patterns they describe are internally consistent across hundreds of sessions given for different people over more than a decade, in ways that researchers found interesting, even where they were not prepared to endorse the metaphysical framework the readings assumed. The psychological and relational observations embedded in the life readings were frequently reported by recipients as genuinely useful, which may reflect nothing more than the universal human tendency to find meaning in frameworks that give narrative shape to experience, or may reflect something about the quality of observation available in the trance state. The record does not allow us to determine which. The world affairs readings are a third category that requires separate treatment. These are sessions in which Cayce addressed broader questions about history, politics, and the future of civilization. Some statements reportedly proved accurate in general terms. Many proved inaccurate in specific terms. The geological changes Cayce described as expected to occur in specific decades of the 20th century did not occur as described. The A.R.E. acknowledges this. Researchers who examine the world affairs readings consistently find them the least reliable of the major categories in terms of verifiable accuracy. The honest accounting of the archive requires holding all of this simultaneously. The physical readings, in the view of sympathetic researchers who have examined them most carefully, represent what those researchers describe as the strongest case for taking Cayce's reported capacity seriously. The life readings operate in a domain where verification is unavailable. The world affairs readings contain a mix of notable statements and documented failures. This is not the portrait of an infallible oracle. It is the portrait of a human being with a reported and unusually documented capacity that appeared, in the assessment of those who examined it most directly, to function within a certain range and become less reliable, or at least less testable. Beyond that range, there is something about that portrait that is, in its way, more interesting than infallibility would be. An infallible oracle would demand a complete restructuring of how we understand knowledge and consciousness. Edgar Cayce, as he appears in the actual archive, remarkable in specific ways, and limited in others according to those who examined it, is a human problem, a problem that asks real questions about the range of human perception, about the relationship between different states of consciousness and the information available in them, about the conditions under which certain kinds of knowing become possible that are not possible in the ordinary waking state. Those questions do not have settled answers. They did not when Cayce was alive. They do not today. Researchers in consciousness studies, integrative medicine, and the study of anomalous experience continue to find the questions raised by the archive worth pursuing. Not because they have decided in advance that Cayce was who his supporters claimed, but because the archive is large enough and specific enough and carefully enough documented that pursuing the questions honestly is a legitimate activity. The 14,000 readings are not proof of anything that resolves cleanly. They are a record that something was happening that the available frameworks of Cayce's era could not, in the view of those observers who examined the cases directly, fully contain, and the invitation they extend to examine honestly and conclude carefully is one that the decades since his death have not yet fully accepted. The archive is still there in Virginia Beach, waiting for whoever is serious enough to sit with it. Chapter 8. What he said about the world. There is a particular kind of claim that sits at the edge of what honest inquiry can work with, not the kind that can be tested and confirmed or tested and rejected cleanly, the kind that lands in the space between. Where the evidence is partial and the interpretation is contested, and the most truthful thing that can be said is that the question is genuinely open in ways that deserve acknowledgement, rather than false resolution in either direction. Edgar Cayce made many claims in his readings that fall into that space. Claims about history, claims about the nature of human consciousness, claims about events that had not yet occurred when he described them. And the most responsible way to engage with those claims is neither to present them as verified fact nor to dismiss them as obvious fabrication, but to examine what is actually in the record, note what can be checked and what cannot, and let the honest shape of the evidence speak for itself. The predictions are where popular accounts of Cayce tend to be least honest and most selective. The popular version of Cayce as prophet assembles a list of things he reportedly said that appear to have come true and presents that list as evidence of prophetic accuracy. The list is real. Several statements Cayce made in readings about events that had not yet occurred reportedly proved accurate in ways that observers found noteworthy. but a list of confirmations assembled without the corresponding list of failures, and without a serious accounting of how many predictive statements were made in total, is not evidence, it is selection. And selection, however sincere the person doing the selecting, produces a portrait that the complete record does not support. So let us work with the complete record as honestly as the available documentation allows. Cayce made statements in readings about a coming global conflict before the Second World War began. Sessions from the 1930s that predate the outbreak of hostilities in Europe reportedly described a coming global conflict, identified certain national powers as likely participants, and spoke of consequences in terms that observers reading the transcripts after the fact found notable. Researchers who have examined the prophetic readings, including those at the A.R.E. who have worked with the transcripts systematically, have been careful to distinguish between statements specific enough to be evaluated and statements general enough to fit almost any major conflict in a world already clearly moving toward instability. The more specific statements showed, in the assessment of those researchers, a degree of accuracy that observers found worth noting. The more general statements proved accurate in the way that general statements about an unstable world often do. The readings also addressed, in various sessions across the 1930s and early 40s, the possibility of further global conflict following the Second. The language in these sessions was consistently conditional in a way that is important to note. The readings did not present future catastrophe as inevitable. They presented it as likely under certain conditions and avoidable under others. This distinction matters because it reflects something consistent about how the readings addressed future events generally. They tended to present the future not as a fixed sequence of events waiting to unfold, but as a field of possibilities shaped by the choices of people and nations. Whether this represents genuine insight into the nature of time and causality, or simply a framing that makes predictions harder to falsify, is a question the record leaves genuinely open. There are also predictions in the record that did not come true, and these deserve equal attention. The readings contained statements about geological changes expected to occur in specific decades. Cayce reportedly described, in multiple sessions from the 1930s and 40s, significant alterations to the coastlines of North America, the disappearance of portions of Japan beneath the ocean, and the emergence of land in the Atlantic connected to what the readings called Atlantis. These changes were described with geographic and temporal specificity. The specified decades have passed. The changes did not occur as described. The A.R.E. acknowledges this directly. Researchers who work with the prophetic readings consistently find them, in their assessment, the least reliable of the major categories in terms of verifiable accuracy. The overall picture that emerges from honest examination is one of significant unevenness. Some statements of notable specificity reportedly proved accurate in ways observers found difficult to account for through coincidence alone. Many statements of comparable specificity proved inaccurate, and a substantial number were phrased in ways that make evaluation genuinely difficult. Not because the language is deliberately evasive, but because the readings used a framework about the malleability of the future that complicates straightforward assessment. What can be said with confidence is that the predictive record is not, in the view of even sympathetic researchers, the strongest part of the Cayce archive. The medical readings represent what those researchers describe as the stronger case for taking his reported capacity seriously. The predictive readings represent the weaker, and the contrast between the two is itself something that a serious examination has to account for. The readings about ancient civilization occupy a different, and in some ways more interesting position. Throughout the 1930s, Cayce gave a series of readings describing in considerable detail a civilization he called Atlantis. These were not given in response to abstract questions about history. They emerged primarily in the context of life readings for specific individuals. In sessions where a past life in Atlantis was described as part of a person's larger soul history, the Atlantis descriptions accumulated across hundreds of sessions given for different people over more than a decade, and they show a degree of internal consistency that researchers found notable regardless of what they concluded about the factual status of the claims. The Cayce Atlantis was not the simple lost island of popular imagination. The readings described a civilization that rose and fell across tens of thousands of years. Developing technologies, the readings described in terms that blend the ancient and the futuristic in ways that mainstream archaeology has no framework for evaluating. They described the use of crystals as energy sources. They described aerial craft. They described a civilization whose technical sophistication eventually exceeded its moral development, producing conflicts that led to the geological catastrophes that ended it. The honest assessment of these readings requires separating two distinct questions that popular discussions often conflate. The first question is whether a real civilization of the type described existed in the Atlantic basin prior to recorded history. This is an empirical question, and the current state of the evidence does not support the claim. No archaeological evidence of a technologically sophisticated civilization of the type described has been found. The geological record of the Atlantic Ocean floor does not show the kind of large-scale land submergence the readings describe in the timeframes they specify. Serious archaeologists and geologists who have examined the question have not found support for the literal existence of the Cayce Atlantis. The second question is different. Whatever the factual status of the historical claims, the Atlantis readings represent one of the most internally consistent bodies of mythological material produced by a single source in the 20th century. Whether that consistency reflects genuine historical memory of some kind, or the remarkable generative capacity of the trance state drawing on sources available to Cayce's era, or something else entirely, is a question the record leaves genuinely open. Cayce himself, when asked in waking life about the Atlantis readings, he expressed the same careful uncertainty he expressed about most dimensions of his work. He said he could not independently verify what the trance state produced. He held it with the same provisional quality that he brought to everything the readings claimed. The description of a hall of records, a chamber, the readings said, was preserved near the Sphinx at Giza, containing records of Atlantean civilization, has attracted attention from researchers for decades. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in the area of the Sphinx and the surrounding plateau have produced results that, depending on how they are interpreted, either indicate the presence of underground chambers or reflect normal variations in the geological substrate. The question has not been settled. What the world affairs and historical readings ultimately represent, assessed honestly, is the application of the trance state to domains where its accuracy is hardest to verify and where the frameworks it draws on are most distant from what mainstream scholarship can evaluate. The contrast with the medical readings is sharp and meaningful. The readings appear to have been most specific and most useful, in the assessment of those who examined them, when they were most oriented toward the concrete circumstances of individual human beings. They appear to have been least verifiable when they were most general, most historical, and most oriented toward the large narratives of civilization and time. That pattern, if it holds, says something interesting about whatever was operating in the trance state. It suggests a reported capacity that functioned within a certain range and became less reliable, or at least less testable, beyond that range. It suggests that the dramatic large-scale claims, which attract the most popular attention, may be the least reliable part of the archive, while the quieter, more specific, more human-scale material may be what those who have examined it most carefully find the most genuinely significant. Consider for a moment a single image from those years. A person sitting across from Edgar Cayce in a quiet room in Virginia Beach, not asking about civilizations or geological catastrophes, asking about a pain that had not gone away, a relationship that had not made sense, a recurring fear whose origin they had never been able to locate, asking the kind of question that does not make headlines, but that represents the actual weight of a human life. That person, that room, that specific, unheroic, ordinary kind of need, that is where the record is most interesting, and that is where we are going next. Chapter 9. Past Lives, Atlantis, and the question that does not go away. Step away from the evidence for a moment, not to abandon it. We will return to it. But there is a dimension of the Cayce life readings that the language of evidence alone does not fully address, and engaging with it honestly requires acknowledging what it is. The life readings were therapeutic before they were cosmological. Edgar Cayce did not invent the concept of reincarnation. He encountered it, as we have discussed, through what appeared in his own readings, in territory he had not sought and could not initially reconcile with his faith. But the particular form in which the Cayce readings presented reincarnation, and the specific uses to which that framework was put in the life readings given to thousands of individuals across more than 2 decades, created something genuinely novel, even within the long tradition of thinking about the soul's journey. The Cayce version was not primarily a cosmological system. It was not mainly concerned with the grand architecture of karmic law across vast stretches of time. Though those elements were present, it was therapeutic. The life readings were given to specific people with specific problems, specific relationship patterns, specific fears and recurring struggles that they had not been able to address through the frameworks available to them. And what the readings offered, in the context of those specific struggles, was a narrative, a story that placed the current difficulty inside a longer arc and suggested a direction forward. A person who found himself repeatedly drawn into a particular kind of damaging pattern in relationships might receive a reading that described a past life in which a similar pattern had played out at a larger scale, with consequences that the reading said were still reverberating in his current circumstances. Whether or not that past life was literally historical, the narrative it provided gave him a framework for understanding a pattern that had previously seemed random, and for approaching the present situation with a quality of intentionality that the simple recognition of the pattern alone might not have supported. This is not a trivial thing. Human beings are narrative animals. We understand our experience through stories, and the stories we use to frame our experience shape what we are able to do with it. Harmon Bro, observing the life readings from his background in psychology and religion, noted that the reported therapeutic effect on the people who received them was real and documentable. In his observation, regardless of the metaphysical claims involved, people described changing. Their relationship to their own difficulties changed. They reported finding themselves able to move through impasses that had previously seemed permanent. Whether the mechanism of that change was the accuracy of the specific past life narrative, or the quality of observation available in the trance state about the person's current psychological situation, or simply the power of a thoughtful and coherent story told by a source the person trusted, is a question that cannot be answered from the outside. What can be said is that the reported outcomes were real to the people who experienced them, that they were documented across hundreds of cases, and that dismissing them entirely because the theoretical framework they came wrapped in is not empirically verifiable misses something important about how human beings actually work. The Atlantis material in the life readings raises its own specific questions beyond the general issue of past life claims. The picture that emerges from the Atlantis readings, assembled across more than a decade of sessions for different individuals, is of a civilization at a level of development described in terms simultaneously ancient and futuristic. The energy systems are not the energy systems of any known ancient culture. The social organization has elements that resemble both the sophisticated and the deeply troubled dimensions of modern civilization. The readings describe a primary energy source, referenced across different sessions consistently enough to be considered a stable feature of the Cayce Atlantis narrative, whose misuse is described as a central factor in the civilization's destruction. It is worth noting that this narrative, whatever its historical status, maps onto anxieties that are genuinely present in modern experience. A highly capable civilization that develops technologies it cannot adequately govern, energy sources powerful enough to transform life and dangerous enough to end it, social divisions between those who use advanced capabilities responsibly and those who use them in the service of power and control. The Atlantis of the Cayce readings is not simply a lost paradise. It is a cautionary civilization, and the caution it embodies connects directly to questions that the 20th century and the 21st have been unable to stop asking. Cayce did not consciously construct this narrative as a metaphor. What came through in the readings came through without his conscious intention or shaping, but the consistency of the Atlantis material and the specific ways in which it mirrors the anxieties of the civilization that produced it is at minimum evidence of the extraordinary generative capacity of the state he was in, and at maximum something that invites more careful examination than a simple dismissal allows. There is a third dimension of the life readings that deserves honest examination because it is the one most likely to produce discomfort. And discomfort examined honestly is more useful than discomfort avoided. Some of the life readings reflect the assumptions of the time and culture in which they were given in ways that are not easy to justify through the therapeutic framework. The readings were given in the American South in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s by a man who was a product of that time and place in ways that the trance state did not entirely transcend. Some readings assigned past lives and described karmic patterns in ways that, read today, reflect racial and cultural hierarchies belonging to the prejudices of their era rather than to any universal spiritual truth. Researchers who have examined these dimensions of the life readings, including scholars who approach the archive with genuine respect for what it contains, have noted that the readings are not exempt from the limitations of the consciousness that produced them, even in the trance state. This is important to acknowledge, not to condemn Cayce, who operated within the understanding available to him, but because honest engagement with the archive requires acknowledging the whole of it. The readings were not produced by a consciousness that had transcended its historical context entirely. They were produced by a man of his time, working at the edge of his capacity, and they reflect that in the ways that all human documents reflect the limitations of their era. The archive contains both the remarkable and the limited. It is a human document for all its unusual qualities, and engaging with it honestly means holding both simultaneously. What Edgar Cayce reportedly saw when he looked at the deeper nature of human experience, in the life readings and the philosophical dimensions of the archive, was a picture of consciousness as something larger and more continuous than a single human lifetime. A picture of the soul as something that learns across time, that carries its history in ways that shape its present experience, that is moving however slowly and however imperfectly towards something. Whether that picture is accurate is a question no one alive today can definitively answer. Whether it is useful is a question the people who received those readings answered for themselves across decades by reporting that something in the picture helped them live better, and whether the question the picture is trying to answer is worth asking seriously. The question of what a human being actually is and what a human life is actually for is not a question at all. It is the oldest question there is. Edgar Cayce spent 45 years lying down and closing his eyes and trying to answer it. He did not get it entirely right, but the attempt, made with that degree of sincerity and that volume of documentation, is not something that can simply be filed away and forgotten. It keeps asking to be examined. Chapter 10. The Body Knows. What medicine made of Edgar Cayce? There is a question that physicians who encountered Edgar Cayce found themselves unable to avoid asking. Even when every professional instinct they had told them, the question was not one their training had prepared them to address. The question was simple. How did he know that? Not in a philosophical sense. In the immediate, practical, clinical sense. How did a man with no medical education, no access to the patient's records, no physical examination, sometimes operating at a distance of hundreds of miles from the person he was reading for, reportedly produce descriptions of physical conditions that were subsequently confirmed by examination, and recommendations for treatment that attending physicians found clinically notable when they applied them? That question was asked by real physicians, with real credentials, about real patients. Across a period of more than 4 decades, the answers they arrived at varied. Some concluded that what they had observed was genuine and unexplained and deserved further investigation. Some concluded that the apparent accuracy was coincidental and that memory had preserved the confirmations while the failures faded. Some occupied the more honest middle ground of saying that they did not know what to conclude, but that the pattern was sufficiently consistent and sufficiently documented that dismissing it without serious engagement was not intellectually defensible. The physical readings were structured consistently across decades of practice. Cayce would be given the name and physical location of the person to be read for. He would lie down, enter the trance state, and the conductor, usually Gertrude in the Virginia Beach years, would suggest that he go to that location and describe what he found in the body. What reportedly came through in the sessions was a description of physical conditions, often in the first person in a way that suggested direct perception, followed by specific recommendations for treatment. The treatments recommended covered an enormous range: osteopathic manipulation, specific dietary changes, hydrotherapy of various kinds, castor oil applied externally in what the readings called packs, various herbal preparations, particular forms of electrical stimulation, specific pharmaceutical compounds, sometimes obscure ones, sometimes ones that had to be specially prepared. The range and specificity of the recommendations is itself one of the features that observers found in their assessment hardest to explain through ordinary means. A man who had studied medicine intensively for years might have a broad enough knowledge base to produce recommendations at that level. But Cayce had not studied medicine. His formal education ended in his mid-teens in rural Kentucky. The vocabulary he used in the readings, the anatomical terminology, the physiological concepts, the pharmaceutical references, were not vocabulary he demonstrated access to in waking life. He would sometimes ask, after a session, what a particular term he had used meant. Multiple observers documented this gap between the vocabulary available in the trance state and the vocabulary available in the waking state, and found it one of the more striking features of his work. Harold Riley was perhaps the most significant medical professional to engage seriously with the Cayce readings over an extended period. Riley was a credentialed physiotherapist who operated a health facility in New York from the 1930s onward. He had no prior connection to Cayce and no particular inclination toward claimed psychic phenomena. His first encounter with the readings came when patients arrived at his facility carrying specific treatment recommendations from Cayce sessions, asking for the particular forms of hydrotherapy and physical manipulation the readings had prescribed. What Riley reported noticing was that the recommendations were clinically coherent in ways he, as a professional, would not have expected from a non-medical source. They were specific enough to be actionable. They were consistent with his professional understanding of physiology, and when he applied them, he reported results in his patients that he found clinically notable with a consistency that exceeded, in his assessment, what he would have expected from random variation. He became involved with the A.R.E. on the basis of what he observed, approaching the work with the pragmatism of a clinician who had found something worth continuing to examine. His book, written with Jess Stern and published after Cayce's death, documents both his observations and the professional skepticism he maintained throughout. It is one of the more useful medical accounts of the Cayce readings, precisely because it refuses the easy positions available on either side of the debate. The castor oil pack deserves specific mention because it represents a case where a Cayce recommendation that seemed eccentric at the time has attracted genuine research attention in subsequent decades. The readings recommended the external application of castor oil, heated and applied to specific areas of the body, for a wide range of conditions, including abdominal complaints, inflammatory conditions, and conditions affecting the lymphatic system. The recommendation appeared frequently enough across the physical readings that it became one of the most recognizable features of the Cayce medical approach. At the time the readings were given, there was no established medical rationale for external castor oil application as a therapeutic method. Physicians who encountered the recommendation tended to regard it as one of the less credible elements. In the decades following Cayce's death, research examining the possible effects of external castor oil application on immune and lymphatic function was conducted by William McGarry, a physician, and Harvey Grady, whose study was published in the Journal of Naturopathic Medicine in 1999. These studies reported findings suggesting effects on lymphocyte production consistent with the mechanism the readings implied. It is important to note that this research was conducted primarily by physicians already involved with the A.R.E. and committed to Cayce's work, which means independent replication from researchers without prior connection to the Cayce community remains limited. The results are suggestive rather than conclusive, and they should be understood in that context rather than as definitive scientific validation. What can be said honestly is that the trajectory from eccentric folk remedy to subject of active research interest is itself significant, and it reflects a pattern that appears in the Cayce medical readings more broadly. Several specific recommendations that seemed anomalous at the time they were given have, in the decades since, attracted research attention that has found at least partial biological plausibility. None of this proves that the readings were accurate in every case, or that the source of the medical information was what Cayce's supporters claimed. What it suggests, in the view of researchers who have examined the specific cases, is that the readings were drawing on an understanding of the body's functioning that was, in at least some dimensions, ahead of what the established medicine of their era had formally recognized. It is essential to say clearly here that nothing in this chapter, and nothing in the Cayce archive, should be read as medical advice or as a recommendation for any specific treatment. The readings were given in specific contexts for specific individuals, and nothing in the record supports applying them as general treatment recommendations today. Anyone with a health concern should work with qualified medical professionals. This is not a disclaimer added for legal reasons. It is a position that the honest reading of the archive itself supports, because Cayce, in the readings, consistently directed people to work with physicians rather than to rely on the readings as a substitute for medical care. There were also failures. This must be said clearly. Not every recommendation in the medical readings was reported as helpful. Not every condition reportedly described was accurately identified. There are cases in the archive where recommended treatments produced no benefit. There are cases where physicians who examined patients after readings found that the descriptions did not match the conditions they found on examination. The failure rate across the medical readings cannot be precisely quantified because the follow-up documentation, while more systematic than for any comparable body of material, is not complete enough to support statistical analysis with full confidence. The honest picture of the medical archive is one of reported accuracy that impressed qualified observers in many cases, and ordinary fallibility in others. That picture, uneven and human in its proportions, is more credible than the mythological version of Cayce as a perfectly accurate diagnostician. It is also more genuinely interesting, because it asks a more difficult question. What were the conditions under which the reported accuracy was highest? What does the pattern of reported successes and documented failures reveal about the nature of whatever was operating? Those questions remain open. The physicians who sat in rooms with Edgar Cayce, who watched him reportedly describe conditions in bodies hundreds of miles away, who applied his recommendations and reported results they had not been able to achieve through other means, made the case for taking the medical readings seriously with the authority of direct clinical observation. They did not always know what to make of what they saw, but they knew they had seen something worth reporting, and the record they left is the part of the archive that the passage of time has made more interesting rather than less. Chapter 11. The War, the Exhaustion, and the Long Goodbye. There is a particular quality to the letters that began arriving at the Virginia Beach address in the early 1940s. They are different from the letters that had come before, different in their weight, different in the specific kind of need they carry. The letters of the 1920s and 30s had been letters from people with illnesses, with chronic conditions, with questions about their lives and purposes. They had been letters from people who were suffering in the ordinary ways that people suffer, the ways that exist in every decade and every generation. The letters that came during the war years carried something else. A wife in Ohio writing that her husband shipped out 8 months ago and his letters stopped coming 6 weeks ago, and she is trying to hold the question at a distance because the alternative is too large to hold directly. A mother in Georgia who has 3 sons overseas, and she is writing at 2 a.m. because sleep will not come, and she has heard that there is a man in Virginia Beach who sometimes knows things that no one else knows. A father in Pennsylvania holding a telegram he has not yet opened and writing first. Writing to Edgar Cayce first. Because opening the telegram feels like the end of something, and writing feels like it might not be. These were the letters of the war years. Cayce read them. He could not ignore them. The faith that had organized his entire adult life told him that turning away from a mother asking about her child was not something he was permitted to do. He had always helped when he could. He would keep helping. And so he did what he always did when faced with more need than could be safely accommodated. He said yes more often than the readings could sustain. He gave more sessions than were good for him. He worked through exhaustion that the people around him could see accumulating, and that he declined to fully acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have required saying no to people he could feel were suffering. The readings had warned him about this. Sessions addressing his own health, going back years, had said that the work required balance, that more than 2 readings per day depleted him in ways that were not trivial, that the quality of what came through was affected by the physical and mental state of the man on the couch. The warnings were specific, and they were repeated. Cayce understood them intellectually. He did not. In the end, find it possible to honour them when the weight of the wartime letters was pressing against his door. By 1943 he was giving 6, 8, sometimes more readings per day. The people around him watched the effects. Gladys Davis recorded them in notes that accompany the transcripts of that period. Notes written in the same careful hand that had recorded everything else. Now noting that Cayce appeared visibly exhausted, that he was losing weight, that his energy between sessions was not recovering the way it once had. Gertrude watched. Hugh Lynn watched. They said what could be said to a man who had spent his entire adult life organizing himself around the obligation to help people who were asking for help. What could be said was limited, because the argument Cayce was implicitly making, that the need in those letters was real, and that the ability to help, however costly, carried an obligation, was not an argument that could be easily countered from within the framework of values he had always lived by. He had always known, at some level, that the cost was accumulating. The readings had told him so, and in the particular way that Edgar Cayce had always related to the information that came through in his sessions. That information was true, even when it was inconvenient. He knew the cost. He chose to pay it anyway, not from recklessness, not from a failure to understand what was happening, from the same quality that had defined him throughout his entire life, the inability to set down the responsibility when the need was clearly in front of him. In the summer of 1944, after more than 4 years of wartime overwork, his body reached the limit that his will had been holding off. He had a stroke. It was not immediately fatal, but it was severe enough to make clear that the readings had to stop. He could no longer give them with any reliable quality, and the people closest to him were united in the assessment that continuing was not possible. He did not strongly resist. The body had made the argument that reason alone had been unable to complete. He died on the 3rd of January, 1945, at his home in Virginia Beach. He was 67 years old. He died quietly, with his family present, in the city where he had done the most sustained and most carefully documented work of his life. He was buried at Riverside Cemetery in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, in the county where he was born and where he had first understood, as a boy with a spelling book beneath his head, that something inside him worked differently from the people around him. Gertrude survived him by 3 months. She died on the 1st of April, 1945, of the tuberculosis that had been part of her story since the early years of their marriage. The illness that the readings had reportedly helped her survive decades earlier and that returned, in the end, as illnesses sometimes return when the body that has carried them for a long time finally loses the strength to hold them back. She was buried beside him in Hopkinsville. They had been married 41 years. The letters of condolence that arrived at the Cayce house after his death came from physicians who had worked with the readings, from people whose conditions had been addressed in sessions he had given, from researchers who had been examining the archive. They were a measure of what the life had meant to the people it had touched, which was the measure that mattered most to the man himself. Gladys Davis remained at the A.R.E., continuing to work in the archive she had built, answering the letters that kept arriving from researchers and seekers and skeptics with the same steady precision she had brought to the stenographic pad beside his couch. She was still there years after everyone else who had been present at the beginning was gone. The archive was, in a meaningful sense, her creation as much as his. Hugh Lynn Cayce took over the leadership of the A.R.E. with the combination of his father's genuine interest in the questions the readings raised and his own considerable practical intelligence about how an organization needed to operate in order to survive. He understood both the genuine dimensions of the archive and the ways in which those dimensions could be distorted by the enthusiasm of believers or the dismissal of skeptics. He worked across the decades following his father's death to position the A.R.E. as an organization committed to serious research and honest examination rather than to the promotion of a mythology. He held that balance until his own death in 1982. The war letters are still in the archive. The ones from the wife in Ohio, and the mother in Georgia, and the father in Pennsylvania, and the thousands of others who wrote in the same desperate register. Some of the answers the readings reportedly gave were accurate. Some were not. Some of the sons came home. Some did not. And Edgar Cayce, who tried to answer everyone at a cost that shortened his life, lies in the cemetery in Hopkinsville, in the county where he was born, beside the woman who was the voice in the readings for more than 2 decades. The mothers who wrote those letters are gone now. The archive remains, and in it, the particular weight of a life spent trying to be useful to people who had nowhere else to turn is present in every carefully filed page. Chapter 12. What Remains? The legacy beyond the legend. Every person who leaves a significant record behind faces the same posthumous fate. The record gets simplified. The complexity that made the person genuinely interesting gets smoothed down in the retelling until what remains is a shape clean enough to carry easily from one person to another. The shape travels. The person stays behind. Edgar Cayce has been through this process more thoroughly than most. In the decades since his death in January of 1945, the simplified version of his story has travelled through popular books, through the spirituality sections of bookstores, through television documentaries, through websites and social media feeds, accumulating with each passage the particular distortions that simplified stories accumulate when they move through populations that want a hero rather than a human being. The sleeping prophet, the greatest psychic of the 20th century, the man who remembered Atlantis, the healer who could see through walls and across distances and into the hidden machinery of the body. Each of those descriptions touches something real. None of them is the whole story. The Association for Research and Enlightenment operates today from its headquarters in Virginia Beach, in a building that was originally the Cayce Hospital, repurchased by the A.R.E. in 1956 and renovated over the decades since. It maintains the digitized archive of readings, making them searchable in ways that Gladys Davis, working with her stenographic pad in the 1920s, could not have imagined. It runs educational programs and supports ongoing research. It maintains a membership base that engages with the materials from a range of perspectives, from the deeply devout to the rigorously academic. Hugh Lynn Cayce made decisions that shaped the A.R.E.'s character in ways still visible today. He resisted the pull toward pure promotion. He insisted on honest engagement with the failures and ambiguities in the record alongside the successes. He brought in researchers with genuine academic credentials and encouraged them to examine the materials critically rather than simply confirming what believers already believed. That approach gave the archive credibility with serious researchers who would otherwise have had no reason to engage with it. The research conducted on the Cayce materials since his death spans several disciplines. In medicine, researchers examining specific recommendations from the physical readings have produced a literature modest in scale but genuine in its engagement with whether the readings reflected medical understanding ahead of what the conventional science of their era had formally established. In psychology and consciousness studies, the specific quality of the trance state Cayce entered has been compared by some researchers to states studied in work on hypnosis and deep meditation, conditions in which the ordinary gatekeeping functions of waking consciousness appear to relax in ways that may allow different kinds of processing to occur. The comparison is suggestive rather than conclusive. It points toward questions rather than answers. Ian Stevenson, whose careful and independent research on children's reported past life memories was conducted with rigorous methodology and published in peer-reviewed venues over several decades, found the broader questions raised by accounts of non-ordinary consciousness worth serious examination in their own right. His work did not specifically endorse the Cayce life readings, but the framework those readings assumed, the idea that consciousness might extend beyond a single lifetime, overlapped with the questions his own independent research had raised through entirely different methods. The alignment is worth noting as an instance of serious researchers working independently, finding similar questions worth pursuing. Beyond the institutional and research legacy, There is the popular legacy, which is larger and messier and more mixed in its effects. Jess Stern's biography, The Sleeping Prophet, published in 1967, introduced Cayce's story to audiences vastly larger than the A.R.E. membership. Stern's book was a popular biography rather than a scholarly work, and it reflected the priorities of popular biography, which are engagement and narrative momentum rather than evidentiary rigour. It presented Cayce in the most dramatic available light, emphasised the predictions and healing accounts, and treated the complications and failures with considerably less thoroughness than they deserved. The book sold millions of copies and created a version of Cayce in the popular imagination that the A.R.E. has been working alongside, sometimes productively and sometimes uneasily, ever since. The dramatic version is better at travelling than the honest version. It makes a cleaner story, and it asserts things about Cayce with a confidence that the evidence does not fully support, projecting onto a public that has no access to the actual archive, a portrait that does not accurately represent what the record shows. The honest legacy of Edgar Cayce is not a confirmation of every claim that has been made about him. It is something more specific and more defensible. It is the documented record of a human being who reportedly could, in a specific altered state of consciousness, access information about the physical conditions of other human beings with a consistency and apparent specificity that qualified observers, in their direct assessments, found difficult to account for through ordinary means. In a body of work documented carefully enough to survive serious examination across 8 decades, he demonstrated, at minimum, that the question cannot be dismissed as easily as either side might prefer. That is not a small thing to demonstrate, and the demonstration, preserved in 14,000 filed transcripts in a building by the ocean in Virginia Beach, is still available for examination by anyone with the patience and the honesty to sit with it. Chapter 13. Why we still come back to him. Step back from the archive for a moment. Step back from the specific readings, the documented cases, the confirmed observations and the failed predictions, and the Atlantis material and the castor oil packs, and the carefully typed transcripts that Gladys Davis produced across 22 years of daily work. Step back from the institutional history and the research literature and the popular mythology that grew up around a man who lay down on a couch in Kentucky more than 100 years ago and started saying things he could not explain. Step back and ask the question that is really underneath all of it. Why are we still here? Because we are. The interest in Edgar Cayce has persisted across decades in a way that is not adequately explained by the momentum of established mythology alone. People who were not alive when Jess Stern wrote his popular biography are finding their way to the archive today and finding in it something that keeps them there long enough to read seriously. What is that something? Part of it is the period we are living in. The early decades of the 21st century are a time of significant questioning of established institutions. For many people, and in parts of the public that cut across political and cultural lines, trust in medical institutions has been strained by events that made visible the gap between what those institutions claimed to know and what they actually knew, between the confidence with which they spoke and the limitations that confidence sometimes concealed. Trust in scientific institutions, while broadly maintained among educated populations, has been complicated by the recognition that scientific consensus can be wrong, that the edges of established knowledge are less secure than the centre, and that the history of medicine contains numerous examples of things once dismissed as implausible proving, in time, to be real. In that climate, a figure like Cayce represents something specific. He represents the possibility that the official account of what human beings are and what human beings can do is incomplete, that the frameworks dominant institutions use to explain human experience leave out things that are real and important, that the dismissal of phenomena not fitting those frameworks is sometimes motivated more by the requirements of the frameworks than by the actual evidence. This is not an unreasonable thing to represent. The history of science is, in part, the history of the official account being revised when evidence required it. The argument that dominant frameworks might be incomplete is not radical. It is, in a strict historical sense, almost certainly true. The risk is that the legitimate recognition of institutional limitation becomes a license for credulity, for accepting any claim that challenges the mainstream, because challenging the mainstream has itself become a value. Cayce's story is sometimes used this way, as evidence not for the specific and limited things the archive actually demonstrates, but for a wholesale alternative to mainstream science, in which conventional medicine is corrupt and hidden knowledge is suppressed. That use of the story is not honest, and it is not safe. It has led people to delay or avoid treatments for serious conditions based on Cayce-derived recommendations taken out of context or applied to situations they were not intended for. Anyone who engages seriously with the Cayce materials will find that the readings themselves consistently directed people to work with qualified physicians. The readings were positioned as a complement to medicine, never a replacement for it. Using them as ammunition against medical care is not supported by the archive and is directly contradicted by the values Cayce expressed throughout his life. The honest version of why Cayce matters today is more specific and more useful. He matters because the questions his life raises are genuinely open and genuinely important. What is the full range of human perceptual capacity, and under what conditions does it become available? What is the relationship between states of consciousness and access to information? And what does that relationship tell us about the nature of mind? What does a body of documented material, like the Cayce archive, too large and too carefully organized to simply dismiss, and too uneven and too dependent on unverifiable frameworks to simply accept, tell us about how we should hold questions that sit at the edge of what established knowledge can address? These are serious questions. They deserve serious engagement. There is also a dimension of the Cayce story that connects to something more personal than questions about consciousness and perception, something that has less to do with what he could reportedly do and more to do with who he was. He was a man who took the suffering of other people seriously, not as an abstraction, not as a category, as a concret, immediate, morally demanding reality that required a response. The wartime letters that poured into Virginia Beach were not, to him, a logistical problem to be managed. They were mothers and wives and fathers and sisters, each one a specific person in specific pain, each one deserving the best response he could offer, regardless of the cost to himself. He was wrong to give more than his capacity could sustain. He was wrong in the practical sense that overextending the work degraded its quality and shortened his life. But the impulse behind the overextension was not a failure of character. It was an expression of the same quality that made him what he was across his entire life. He could not look at suffering and turn away. In a world that has become skilled at managing its exposure to the suffering of others, at constructing daily lives insulated enough from acute need that the obligation to respond is rarely directly encountered, that quality is something, not a model for behaviour in every circumstance, but a reminder of something that is possible in a human being. The other dimension of his character that the contemporary moment finds resonant is his comfort with not knowing. He did not know where the information in the readings came from. He said so. Consistently, for 45 years, he had frameworks he found useful: the universal mind, the Akashic records, the soul's continuity across lifetimes. But he held those frameworks provisionally rather than with the certainty of a man who has arrived at final answers. He was genuinely uncertain about the most fundamental questions his own life raised, and he was able to keep working from inside that uncertainty rather than needing to resolve it before proceeding. The ability to act responsibly from a position of genuine uncertainty, to take seriously the things that are real and documentable without claiming more than the evidence supports, to hold the open questions as open rather than closing them prematurely in either direction, to be honest about what you know and what you do not know, even when the not knowing is uncomfortable. Cayce was not always successful at this. There were moments when the readings made assertions that subsequent evidence did not confirm, and that the humility he otherwise demonstrated should have flagged as speculative. He was human in these failures, as in everything else, but as a general orientation, held across a long life in genuinely complicated circumstances. His relationship to the unknown was one of engagement rather than either credulous acceptance or defensive dismissal. He sat with the questions. He let them be as large as they actually were, and he kept doing the work that the questions pointed toward, one afternoon session at a time, for more than 4 decades, in an era that wants fast answers and clean conclusions, and the certainty that comes from committing fully to one side of a debate. That posture is not a failure. It is, in its own quiet way, an example worth considering. Come back to the beginning. The small room in Christian County, Kentucky. The young man lying on the narrow bed with his hands folded on his chest. The voice that had been silent for nearly a year suddenly speaking, with a specificity that those present reportedly could not account for, about things it had no ordinary means of knowing. That moment did not resolve into anything simple across the 45 years that followed it. It produced a long, complicated, genuinely human life, organized around something unusual and demanding, marked by real failures alongside real achievements, documented more carefully than almost any comparable life has been documented, and still generating serious questions in the minds of serious people more than 80 years after the man at the center of it drew his last breath in Virginia Beach on the 3rd of January. 1945. The archive is in Virginia Beach. The questions are still open. The mothers who wrote the wartime letters asking whether their sons were coming home are gone now. The physicians who sat in rooms watching a man with no medical training reportedly describe conditions in bodies hundreds of miles away are gone. Gladys Davis, who recorded everything from September of 1923 until the very end, is gone. Gertrude, who was the voice he heard, asking the questions across more sessions than can easily be counted, is gone, both of them buried in Hopkinsville. In the county where the story began, the typed pages remain, 14,306 of them, cross-referenced and digitized and available to anyone with the patience to sit with them honestly What do you do with a record like that? You do not accept it all. The geological predictions did not come true. The Atlantis, the readings described, has not been found. Some cases the readings addressed did not go as the readings suggested. The framework of past lives and cosmic records and the soul's long journey through time lies entirely outside what current scientific methods can evaluate. And the honest response is to hold it as an open question rather than a settled one in either direction. But you do not dismiss it either. The medical readings, examined carefully by qualified physicians and researchers across 4 decades, produced a body of reported observation that those observers found, in their assessments, not adequately explained by the conventional frameworks available to them. The specific recommendations that appeared in those readings and that subsequent researchers have found at least partially plausible represent a body of apparent knowledge that sits at the edge of what we understand about how knowledge works. He demonstrated, at minimum, that the question cannot be dismissed as easily as either side might prefer. What you do with a record like that is what Edgar Cayce himself did with the experience that generated it. You sit with it honestly. You hold the questions as large as they actually are. You take seriously what is real and documentable. You hold provisionally what is suggestive but unverified. You acknowledge what is wrong or unsupported. And you stay with the question underneath all the specific questions. The one that the archive keeps asking on every one of its 14,000 pages. What are we, really? What is this consciousness we carry through our days? With its ordinary limitations and its occasional extraordinary reach, what does it mean that a man in Kentucky, in the first half of the 20th century, could lie down and close his eyes and go somewhere that produced a body of reported knowledge large enough and specific enough and carefully enough documented to still be examined seriously by researchers a century later? We do not have a settled answer to that question. Edgar Cayce did not have one either. He had the question, held carefully across a long life, and the willingness to keep working from inside it without demanding that it resolve before he could proceed. That willingness is the thing the archive finally demonstrates most clearly. Not that the answers are available, that the questions are worth asking. Sleep. If you are ready, the questions will be here when you wake. They always are. And somewhere in the archive, in a building not far from the ocean in Virginia Beach, a typed page that Gladys Davis prepared on a particular afternoon in a particular year is still waiting, along with the 13,305 others, for whoever is serious enough to come and read it. He lay down and closed his eyes. He went somewhere. He came back with things he could not explain, and he did that, afternoon after afternoon, year after year, for 45 years. That is the whole of it. That is enough. Good night.